And Perl behaved a little bit spectacular. You could set empty cookies, and you could send cookies whose name ended on a colon. So it was not further looked at, but that looks like some severe parser problems there. So to wrap it up, session fixation. 9 out of 12 open source content management systems were vulnerable to session fixation in one way or the other. Most of the ones were cookie-based. If you look at web application frameworks, the easiest way to set a cookie on the client is header injection. 2 out of 5 were vulnerable, and a different work says that 5 out of 8 web application frameworks are vulnerable to session fixation. So because that was just content management systems, and these later 2 case studies look at the web application frameworks. So how would a solution look like? As mentioned already, is you have a straightforward solution is that you once an authorization change, even going from unauthorized to authorized or from going from authorized to unauthorized, every time you do this in your application, you should send out a new session ID. However, the vulnerability or the problem is in the web application. It's not the web application that is under attack. So this also explains why there is sometimes little interest by the application providers to find, or if found, to quickly fix those problems, because it's not affecting them in the first place. It might affecting them in the long run if users tend to run away, if there are too many problems with the web application, but not in the first place. So the proposed solution is to build a proxy which runs on the server side, or on the client side, that is. But for a moment, think about it running on the server side in front of the web application, which strips off all session identifiers that come from the web. Do we have that here? Yeah. So we have a proxy here, and we now have 2 session identifiers. We have one session identifier that the application uses that might be vulnerable to session fixation, and we have a proxy session identifier named PSID. And the proxy is the only one who can link the proxy session identifier to the real session identifier. It will, once it receives a request with only an SID in it, it will throw that away and will establish a new session which has a PSID in it. And it will also generate an SID for that relates and linked to that PSID. The PSID will be stripped off on the proxy side, so the application server can remain unchanged and is unmodified. So to conclude, the public level of attention for this vulnerability is still rather low, and the real-world applications that have been tested indicate that you should think about that as a real problem. Because like online banking websites, 2 out of 5 are vulnerable. They tested one internet access provider which was vulnerable. And so there is a risk out there. And the fixing, renewing the session ID in the application is fairly easy. The proxy was used in a business setting to buy the developers more time to fix the problem. And as I said, on the server side, it's quite easy because you know what your application does, you know how a login looks like, you know how the SIDs look like. They might not all be called SIDs, depending on what frameworks you use, or if you want to use your own SIDs, you're free to do that. So on the server side, this is not a big deal. On the client side, there's some future work going on at the moment, how to detect the parts in a cookie or in a URL that actually carry the session ID, because you have to know the session ID in order to warn the client or to generate a new proxy session ID. You have to know when what is the session ID and if it stays the same or not. But it looks like promising that it is also possible to do this on the client side. And just the last point that I would like to stress is doing this on the client side would actually solve the problem where the attack vector ends, because it's the client in the end that got his credentials stolen and whose account was misused. And it might be also the one who is investing some time and resources into fixing the problem. That's it. Thank you for your attention. Any questions? Okay, let me repeat the question. Is the mapping that is done from the PSID to the SID, if that is secret? No, it's not secret. You're just handing out the client two session IDs, basically, one for the proxy and one for the real application. And the proxy keeps track of what has been valid proxy session IDs and what the valid session ID from the web application that maps on this one is. And whenever something arrives here that does not have a valid session ID, proxy session ID and the corresponding web application session ID, it will be detected as something fishy going on here and will be probably rejected. Well, no, this is not. You make the assumption that this is vulnerable to session fixation. It's not. That's the idea. Okay, say again.
If the attacker sends both the information, PSID and the SID, and then the proxy maps it to the SID that the server understands.
Yeah. Okay. Of course, yes, we can try to fixate a session that has a proxy session ID. The idea is that the proxy takes place, takes the that the proxy is always renewing the session once an authorization level change has taken place. So once you log in, you get a new proxy SID. So you can't fixate that because the proxy server is changing it after the login has taken place. That was it.
Yeah. You mentioned in one of your first slides that the attacker sends a SID and then the application has to be vulnerable or something. You mentioned something about the vulnerability. If I say it again, it was one of your first slides. Yeah, there. Set cookie via other vulnerability. What do you mean there?
On the first stage, you have to. So, what is the set cookie via other vulnerability mean? The idea here is that if your application wants to have the session ID in a cookie, in order to fix it, you have to have the first request from the victim have this session ID in the request. And if it needs to be a cookie, you have to set a cookie on the victim's machine that carries the session ID you choose as an attacker. And that's the fixation, actually. And that's only possible because the application does not change the session identifier. Another question.
In that case, if you do change your session ID to the solution here, what happens if you, let's say in the case of a commerce site, what happens if you have put something in your shopping cart, then you change your SID? How can you transfer this object inside the screen?
Good point. So if you want to change the session ID, you probably have stored something on the back end that is related to this session. So the question is, how do you copy all these objects or all this information? And depending on the framework you're looking at, there are frameworks that allow you to copy between the object from one session identifier into another session object. Some do and some don't. There you have to write the code yourself. And if you see this, then you also know, okay, if that is not provided by the framework, it's highly unlikely that an unskilled programmer actually stumbles across this problem and then writes code which transfers objects from bound to one session into the next or into the renewed session. But there are frameworks that allow you to copy the objects that are bound to a session quite easily from one session to another.
You're saying that you need to reissue a session ID and you're doing your proxy close to the server. I see that you have the information of knowing where they are logging into the website. Let's suppose you use the client side. How will you be able to know on which point to actually authenticate to the application?
Okay, repeat the question. On how do you know on the client side on which port you at which point? Sorry, on which point you?
Because of your future work, you actually could use the proxy solution instead of server side on the client side.
Yes.
But there it's crucial to know which URLs will actually result in an authenticated session.
Yes. As I said, you might want to ask more glory details of that, Bastian Braun, and I'm happy to provide you with the contact details. But as far as I'm knowing, the problem to detect that a login takes place on the client side is rather simple compared to knowing where the session ID is actually stored in, or what's the name of the cookie value is that contains the session ID. Because looking at the IDs and things stored in cookies today by a regular web application is so overwhelming that you don't know which information, or that it's harder to know which information contains the session identifiers that are carried from one session to another than if a login has taken place. But they probably know more about that than I do.
One thing I want to understand about the proxy. Proxy has to be designed quite customized for the application.
It has to know which parts of the session IDs, and it has to know when a login takes place and when not. So that is the customization that you can easily do on the server side, yes.
More of a comment than a question. One of the other places where you can fix this problem is if the underlying application server changes the session ID for you on authentication, and that's something that the application server is starting to add. For example, it's been in Tomcat since the beginning of this year.
Okay. Yeah, that is actually the point where you know, okay, if there is a framework that does support that, then it's probably being much often and more easily used by the developers of the applications on top of it. Good point. I'll relay that to Bastian as well. Any more questions? Then I'm happy to have made it on time and get you all back to the last session of today.